Thank you so much, Adrian. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for Fico and all of you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the things, certainly at IDO, but I myself in particular, particularly enjoy is being able to share some of our insights, some of our experiences, some of our tools, some of our methods that we have gained with people such as yourselves. So very happy to have this opportunity. Just by way of brief other introduction, yes, as Adrian said, I'm principal consultant here at IDEL. I'll give you a quick one slide on who we are in a moment. I think I recognize some organization names, so some of you have worked with us down the years. But yeah, I've been doing impact measurement, impact reporting, impact reports, so the works for that duration that Adrian had talked about. Started off in the secular non-profit space, and then about 7 years ago moved into IDO, kind of aligning my own faith with the kind of the expertise and the area I was working in. So I'll touch on a bit more of that as we go with some of the maybe examples I talk about, but love talking about impact, probably a bit too much. So I'm aiming for 35 minutes. I will keep my eye on the clock and I'll shush if I go on too much longer than that. So just give you the one slide on who IDO is. We exist to help improve the impact of Christian organizations. We do it through four main areas. One, we help people design theories of change, strategies, programs, etc. Number two, we conduct kind of really high quality research on important questions that individuals or the sector would like more insight on. Number three, we do a lot of impact and impact evaluation, in particular, looking at both social and spiritual impact, which I will touch on. And lastly, where explicitly we help people report that impact that they may be capturing and communicating. So that's who we are. We've been around, for about 8 years. I was the first employee. Happy to say more if people have questions, but I'll leave it there for now. So just what I'm going to cover with you, I wanted to make it very practical. So I'm going to share with you some of the most common tools and frameworks and the things that we use when people ask us to help them define, communicate, and report on their impact. So 4 things I'm going to cover, different lengths each one, but one, I'm just going to define a couple of terms, only so you know what I mean when I say certain things, and make sure we're all on the same page with what we're talking about. Number 2, spend more of the time talking about the main tool that we use to help organizations, particularly when it comes to comms and fundraising, but not exclusively, talk about their impact. How do they articulate that well? How might they use that to structure public facing documents, reports, etc. And I'm going to talk it through in a way that I hope already that even if you never hear from us again, you would actually be able to take it away as something that you might find valuable. And I'm going to tell you a little history of it as well. Thirdly, I'm going to touch very briefly on the question we get asked a lot, like how do you go about doing this around spiritual impact? So a little bit on that, won't be a lot, but I know it's always something that comes up. And then lastly, again, very practically, when we explicitly come alongside organizations to help them write a public facing, often yearly, the annual report, which might be called an impact report, there's a series of steps we recommend they go through. And I'm just going to give you those because, again, very practical, hopefully very helpful for you in where you're at as a fundraiser. So that's what we're going to cover. So just define a couple of terms, which hopefully will put us all on the same page. So the word impact, used a lot these days. My whole kind of career, if you like, I started as a researcher and then the impact word exploded. And I sort of ended up specializing in that. So just the easiest metaphor I use to get immediately away from understanding some of the more technical, nerdy language, which, as you'll see in a moment, I don't tend to use anymore, is very simple. When we're talking about impact and also an associated, often blurred word, outcome, it's really helpful to think about an archer or the act of archery. On the one hand, when you talk about someone's activity, you're talking about that person is simply firing arrows. It is a description of what you do. The word output comes up a lot. In the context of the archer metaphor, the arrow is counting this archer, she fired 6 arrows. That's what you're counting. It's not that it's unhelpful to know, but ultimately that wasn't the point in firing the arrows. And then lastly, to use the word outcome here, the outcome is, okay, well, how many hit the target? What was the result of what you did? So I find that just a very helpful picture metaphor. If you ever, which you might get, asked, what are your outputs? What are your outcomes? What are your activities? I find that a very helpful way of explaining it very concisely, and it makes perfect sense, therefore, how those three things are different things. Then the thing at the bottom, I'll just say for help conciseness sake, when I'm going to use the word impact from now on, I'm going to use it as this collective term to refer to all of the outcomes, i.e. that thing on the right-hand side, that a project or an organization delivers. In different contexts, that word does mean specific things. We don't need to go into that today, and I won't go into that today. But if anyone tells you it means a certain thing, they're not actually telling that they mean in a certain context. And when I say impact, I'm talking about the collective change, the collective outcomes that a project or an organization is delivering. So that's the first thing, which I hope is both helpful and makes it clear what I'm going to speak about when I'm talking about the word impact. And then secondly, part of the what I was asked to talk about with the impact reports. And again, I think from our experience, my experiences could refer to three particular things. So helpful to name these. The first one, some people might come to us and say, we'd love you to do an impact report on our project. And what they mean is we want to assess what impact has this project or program or whatever it might be has had. The second one we're often involved in as well is we have had a funding grant or donation, whatever it might be, and we need to produce an impact report specifically for that, funder. So totally legitimate, but often required. And the third one, which is, more and more so, I think even when I started my career, annual report was the most common term. I think almost everyone calls annual reports the legal document now, impact report. So that, in my mind, refers slightly more broadly to the public annual report communicating the work of an organization or ministry or whatever it may be. So I'm going to kind of speak to all three of those, but just to name that there are different things that people might mean when they ask us, for example, to help them develop an impact report. And the tools I'm going to talk through are mostly relevant to all three, and I'll make it clear when I'm speaking specifically about one of those and not the others. So I want to sort of start off with a bit of the story of where some of my thinking, particularly in the main tools that we use at IDO, began. So I've always been, before I joined up with IDO in its consultancy role for the Christian sector, was head of impact, head of evaluation, head of M&E, which is a phrase I dislike, but that's a mini preach for another time. And my experience over doing that for about 10 years or so, roughly speaking, was I would get different members of, my colleagues, often the marketing team, often the fundraising team, but not always, coming up to me and asking me for stuff. They would come up and say, hey, what can I tell people publicly about the impact we've made? Or they'd say, oh, can you please remind me about the difference between outputs and outcomes because I need to, write it in a bid or something. Or there'd be a messaging campaign going on and they'd say, hey, what evidence can I put on our social media that young people have this, urgent need around loneliness? Or it is a funding bid and it's requiring specific outcomes, and they say, hey, can you come and help us draft really clear, compelling outcomes? Or that the organization told everyone publicly that they supported disadvantaged young people, but then said, said, what evidence have you got? And they come to me and say, what evidence have we actually got that we support disadvantaged young people? And then the top one, which is my kind of personal favorite, was I would say, oh, have you developed a theory of change at all? And they'd say something like, oh, I'm pretty sure some consultant made one once upon a time and we've never ever looked at it since. So I just think all of this was coming together in my experience and serving them all individually. And I thought there is these have a commonality. These questions can be joined up in a helpful, coherent way to now allow at the time me within those organizations to help have a common way of thinking about talking about our impact, and then as relevant kind of collecting information and evidence against it to talk about it compellingly and stories and the like. And that evolved through my career into the model we particularly use at IDO that I'm now going to talk you through, called what we call it an impact strategy model. So this is what I'm going to hopefully arm you with as a helpful tool in thinking about impact reports, both generally in all senses of those words, but also in any kind of specific way you want to think about communicating the impact of your organization or ministry. And the thing I will just say up front is I do have a element of imposter syndrome talking to a group such as yourself. I have technically been a trust fundraiser for 2 years of my career, but whilst I did quite enjoy it, I missed measuring impact and doing research, so I switched back. But all that to say, I developed this particularly so I could work well with fundraising colleagues and communications colleagues. Um, but I always wondered, am I actually adding anything when we talk about this model? Am I actually adding anything that isn't already known by yourselves as kind of expert fundraisers and communicators? And I just think the truth is, time and again, when particularly this model I'm about to walk through, we talk about it, and fundraisers might come on a training course or whatever it might be, they tell me it's actually remarkably helpful. It's not completely brand new, you'll see, but there's something about it which is they've never quite seen before. So I just have this, just quote on the screen simply to almost give myself some confidence that what I'm going to share with you may be definitely of value. And it just quote just strikes me amazingly because I did this piece of work where I was building, it was a narrative document, which, using the model I'm talking through. And it got, sort of quality assured by one of the trustees of this ministry who kind of came back and said, even as a trustee, I thought I understood the ministry. And actually now I've seen this material that, that IDO produced. It's actually even made it much more clearer to me what this ministry is about, the impact they're trying to have and how they're trying to have it. And so I kind of take that as a encouragement. But all that to say, I'm hoping that there's going to be a benefit in what we're going to talk through now for all of you, even if some or many of you are very experienced kind of fundraisers. So the other piece of history, just to give you the components, and this will hopefully resonate with some of you, is that history. Another way of looking at my career, how I built the way of thinking about this is when I started my career. There's a I'm gonna use some technical language here only for the sake of telling the story, but I was started and said that this is a logic model. And logic model basically has a flow from inputs to outputs to outcomes to impact. And someone sat down with me and said, this is a logic model. You should always use this to talk about impact. Then, as I said, those 2 years of my career, when I kind of ended up being a bit of a lead trust fundraiser, I was sat down and said, simplest way of thinking about a case for support is define what the problem is you're trying to address, define your solution, and define why you are particularly well placed to deliver it. That also made perfect sense to me. Around, I don't know, 2016, roughly, I think StoryBrand, I think was maybe its sort of well-known height, that marketing frame of how do you tell your organizational story in terms of the elements of a compelling story. And I kind of found that fascinating as well, and drew out these ideas. The base of every story has a kind of a setting, a characters, a challenge that character is facing, a kind of a plot and a resolution. I was like, this is interesting as well. This is how you start telling a story, and it's starting to have I'm seeing some things lining up. And then last but not least, in one point in my career, I started studying kind of program design, how you design programs to be effective in the first place. And they really emphasize two other things, which is how well can you define your audience and understand your audience? And therefore, how can you work out how you want to design that program so it will be effective for that audience? And all of this to say, I kind of, I guess this is where my brain worked, took all of this together and said, they are all playing on the same concise set of base questions that they are asking about an organization, or saying an organization will do well to have the ability to define. And again, fast forward a lot of evolution, this is the model that we work with. There are 5 base questions and then 2 additional that I'll talk about. And at its simplest level, this is my kind of proposition to you this afternoon, this lunchtime, is that we found it very helpful, or people have found it very helpful to work with us to define clear answers to 5 questions. 1, how well can you articulate the situation you exist to address? And this could be at an organizational level, this could be at a project level. Number 2, in fully narratively, logically linked to that, who then are the groups of supporters, sorry, not supporters, who are the beneficiaries, if you use that word, who are the service users, who are the individuals, who you come alongside, who you support, who you offer interactions to address that situation. Once you define that, how clearly can you define what successful change looks like? So it brings in that outcome word. With those things set, how then do your activities, the thing you do day by day, week by week, month by month, how do they deliver those outcomes for those people to address that situation? And then question number 5, how well can you articulate in the first instance, why is the way you do those activities, the way they're designed, the way your organization is structured, why is that an effective way at delivering those activities to deliver that change for that group to address that situation? And as I said, my experience is that these aren't new questions necessarily, but I guess just being very open, my experience is that particularly in my last 7 years of working with this model heavily in the Christian organizations, the chances are they've never defined all of them at the same time in conjunction with one another. And therefore, when you start thinking about talking about impact, it sort of becomes a bit of a disjointed story that potentially is being told. And then the last two, which we think is very important, and we work in both from our kind of faith background ourselves, but also our specialism as research and evidence gatherers. The first one is saying how well can you add in to your impact story the role of God and faith, both in motivating some of those answers, but also where is God at work from your perception in some of those. And that's why I one of the advertising for this event, it touched on kind of theological alignment. And I do think that's where that's interesting. It plays in. We've worked with hundreds of Christian ministries across different traditions, denominations, theological perspectives, and you do see theology underneath all of these, and therefore we think it's very helpful to, at least internally to begin with, start articulating, how do we understand the role of God and faith in those answers? And then that number 7th question is, as they have been articulated, how do you know that? What evidence do you have? Not necessarily talking about kind of statistical evidence or external evidence, but even internal. What stories do you have? What expertise do you have? Why do you think those things are true? And as I said, my central premise really is when wanting to compellingly communicate your impact, we haven't found any substitute for beginning to have all of these answers really clearly written as a base, that universal. It is highly similar, I'm aware of a case for support, but a very impact focused case for support, telling that story which is very logically consistent and yet at the same time narratively compelling, and having that as a base document to draw from, to say this is the impact story that we are trying to put into place in the world, and therefore we're trying to communicate to different audiences as relevant. So as I said, I'm just going to go through this a bit more detail with the hope that actually there are some things you can immediately take away and think, you know what, I'm really good at answering A, C, and E for my organization, but that's a really good point. I've never thought about answering the others. So I'm just going to run it through it, and hopefully that's sheds a bit more light on it. So if you were to go about thinking about that first question, what situation you address, the way we would communicate doing it well is first of all naming, and it's not always one, but what are the problem or problems, need or situations, depending on how it's framed. But then importantly, thinking about these other two, why is it bad? What's the consequence? I've worked with a lot of ministries that will start off with stating the thing that they're trying to change, but it's not really obvious off the bat why that's an urgent, compelling problem that should have kind of resources attached to it. And then the second one is that's sort of the forward looking, and then it's the coming back is, and what's causing it? How can you show that you really understand the situation in order to be an organization or a ministry that's well placed to actually address it in the first place? And then those bottom two will occur on every slide, but I think they're worth remembering. What evidence do you actually have for those thoughts? And what is the role of God and faith in your understanding? So just as one example here, a lot of ministries we work with, particularly in the UK, but also in the US, will start by just stating the problem that, from their perspective, it's a real problem that the number of people identifying as Christians attending church is decreasing. That makes sense. I would agree with that sentiment. And then you say, why do you think that is? Why as an organization are you saying this is how we're addressing it? And then you get a full diversity of different answers. Is it because the church is no longer a positive force? Is it because traditional methods of proclamation don't work anymore? Is it because sharing faith is not happening where most people engage non-Christians, which is their workplace? Is it because parents are not being supported to help their children grow up in the faith? The point is not who's right and wrong as such. The point is, as an organization, what's your message? Which is it you're going after? How clearly are you able to state that? And how clearly are you able to make it a compelling answer that someone says, I actually agree with that. I'm interested in, supporting your organization or whatever it may or may not be. So in that one, it's often the cause of the problem that starts to separate out different organizations. It also does start to separate out theological kind of underpinnings and perspectives. That second question then, kind of who do you support and engage? Not a difficult one off the bat, but what we suggest in thinking through is who is that ultimate group or beneficiaries or service users, whoever it may be within society, whether you engage them or not, whether you're kind of an indirect organization. If it's different, who are those indirect organizations? What characteristics particularly make them who you support? I'll touch on that in a moment quickly. What are their strengths? If we're talking about asset-based community development as an example, like what is it about them that they're bringing to the table that you're working alongside to further enhance their situation or overcome a challenge? So that's kind of really actually how well are you telling that story and bringing those people to life in a way that's compelling to people and is obvious they'd be the group to react and respond to and come alongside in response to the situation. So just as a very simple example, and I suspect it's a group of fundraisers, this is more in line with what you do, but it's an example that certainly resonates when we talk to Christian ministries generally. It's very easy and certainly relatively clear to say something like, oh, we help churches support young people's mental health, but just pushing it a little further in articulation might go as far as saying we help young people aged 16 to 21 engage positively with their mental health. We do this through equipping small churches who are struggling to find engaging ways to talk about it. 8 in 10 of those we support say alone they would lack the resources to do this without us. So it's just expanding. A lot of this is just in a version of this document or whatever it might be, you might produce this being that much clearer, starting to tell the story of all the different characters. So just in that, even that small example, the small churches now have become a character in that narrative as well as the young people. The third area, which I think is where people naturally begin when they say, well, we want to talk about our outcomes and our impact, and that makes perfect sense. And one of the things hopefully I'm communicating is certainly that's valuable, and I'm going to talk through how to do that well, but we would say it needs to be couched within this wider story rather than simply a statement of the changes you're hoping to bring about or evidence of the changes you are bringing about. So for this one, thinking about what's your kind of thing in the long term. So at this moment, we don't think about what is measurable per se, or even what's fully within our kind of control or influence. But what's that dream, that long-term vision of the change you're hoping to see? And then secondly, as different, you can do it different ways. A year, 1 year, beyond 1 year, beyond your interaction or within your interaction, but a shorter term version of like, and what's the step of change? How can you describe the change that's going to happen in order to lead to that long-term change? They're the helpful things to think about. And then again, there's that kind of evidence question and why do you think God would like those outcomes? That's always an interesting one to ask people and see how well they can answer that question. So give you some practical ideas of how we go about helping people do this as clearly as possible. We use a lot of frameworks like the one on the screen. It's not the only one we use, but we help people think through. If they start with something like, oh, we just want to see people's lives transformed by the gospel, as an example. That those words kind of make some sense, but at the same time could mean absolutely anything. Or equally, we want lives changed by the power of sport. Whatever it is, those are good opening sentences, but if you want to tell that compelling story of change, it helps to start breaking that down into, okay, what does it actually look like at change at the individual level? What are those beliefs that you're hoping to see change in someone, for example? The belief in their own agency, belief in the central importance of climate change as an issue. What are those behaviors? How are they actually, you're going to hope they change what they do? Is it about how often they volunteer? Is it about how often they pray? And then lastly, we think this is particularly important in the Christian space, where we just kind of experiences by, what do you want them to experience in their lives? Is it an increased sense of peace in their lives? Is it improved sense of the quality of the relationships of those around them? And it's not hard and fast. There are other categories we sometimes use, but the key is to be specific, to use these frameworks to name that change at a level that someone paying attention would say, I really resonate with that because I think that I would love that in my life, or that's happened in my life and it's been so important. Whatever it might be, it's moving it to that person level specificity of what change looks like that you're hoping to create. And again, in the story that we've started telling for those groups you very clearly described, to address that situation and those causes that you also have been able to articulate as clearly as possible. After that, the flow of this narrative that we suggest does become the activity. So rather than necessarily starting here, having this fourth, because when someone looks potentially at, if you are using all 5 categories, again, I'll touch on this a bit in a moment. If you are using all 5 categories, the activity should make perfect sense now based on everything you've said. If you said, here's the problem and the causes, here are the groups we want to try and engage and influence and come alongside, here's a change we want to make, it really does put the ante on like, okay, does what you do is actually going to get that done? Because it'll start to obviously be like, I don't think that's going to get that done because you've set this really compelling vision of change. So this one really is like, what do you do for those groups in a way that sounds really well kind of thought through and as a strong story? And then lastly, the 5th question is looking across all 4 of them really, but it's saying, what is it about your approach? Again, that could be organizationally, that could be at a program level or activity level or resource level, why you think that's an effective way of doing it. So again, 3 particular questions here. Why have you chosen to deliver it that way? There's an answer to that question. What is unique or specific about the way you particularly deliver that activity or that work? How is it that the way you are delivering it is particularly geared to or helpful towards those you have chosen to engage with, come alongside, or support? These are the kind of questions that help you think through, okay, how are we making this case for why we're doing what we're doing and that we want someone to come alongside and support us financially or otherwise. So let me give you another example just to really ground this particular concept. So this is based on a piece of research that was done in the kind of secular youth space, but it's very illustrative. So if we use 2 words we've used already, the activity that this program was operating was a young person meeting with a mentor. It was about career mentoring. And they were very clear. The outcome we want to see is that that young person is able to secure a job that is right for them. Well, it's very, very clear. That makes perfect sense. If we bring in this concept that we call success factors, which is what makes you effective, what this is based on some research, what this research was able to show is that there is the quality criteria that need to be in place for that activity to lead to that outcome, with things like the young person having a power to shape, the young person being respected, the young person being cared for experiencing care for, person having realistic goals, motivated, and practical help. And why that's interesting is that they would then, in theory, enable the story of that program to be told more compellingly, to allow someone to say, yeah, actually, if I'm going to repeat that program, we need to make sure those success factors are in place, not simply the repetition of those activities in isolation. And I won't go through all of this. I'm presuming I'm very happy to circulate the slides afterwards. But this is just some examples we have heard from Christian ministries at the different levels of what makes you effective. So the top one at organizational level, what makes you effective. That second one at a delivery level, what makes you effective. The third one is again trying to focus on the assets and the strengths of the people you might be working with. What do they bring to the table that they are going to need to do to make your work as effective as best you understand? And then lastly, but equally importantly, how are you understanding and engaging the role of God, faith, and the church in making your program, your activity effective? So that's a very rapid run through of one of the core frameworks that we help people work through. And again, I'll say what I said at the start. My experience and our experience is not that people don't have answers to these, it's that they haven't necessarily answered them all together in a single visual document, whatever it might be, in a way that actually really makes a lot of sense, and therefore reads as a impact story, for want of a different phrase. And our position is always, if you want to start communicating your impact more powerfully, more helpfully, more compellingly, this is probably the best place to start as a base document, not thinking about internally, how would we answer these questions? And then using that base document to, flex, like as an, an audience is particularly interested in the situation. So we use that information, or there's an audience who's really interested in why what we do is particularly effective, and therefore how do we communicate our success factors alongside our activities as compellingly as possible. But again, all of it is about impact. It's like what's the inverse of the impact? What's the problem in the first place? Who are you trying to have an impact on? What is that impact? And what are you going to actually do to make that impact happen as best that's in your control? And then again, that theological lens, and different organizations prefer to keep this internal. Some people prefer to have this external explaining theological positions, whether it's scriptures or otherwise, that say this is why we really believe any of the answers that we are communicating to you in these areas. And then lastly, again, how are you evidencing that? How are you making that compelling? How are you making that something that the particular audience you're communicating to is going to kind of believe it and hold it to be true? So 3 relatively straightforward. I've inadvertently said this a few times, but just if this is something like that makes a lot of sense, how do you even go about it? Just 3 simple steps. First of all, take those questions and write an articulation of them as best you can. Then secondly, as relevant, those stories and statistics, as fundraisers, you'll notice, like we need to say it, that those 2 are both needed for different audiences in different combinations. But the thing about that story is you can use your answers to this model on a single story of a single person, but it's about how do you, if you're capturing that case study or that spotlight story or whatever it might be, how do you show each of those components? That's where really it's just taking it fully from that story arc model. How are you showing all of those things in that story to really tell that powerful impact story? And there's just a note there to say, as you do, the reality of doing this is that often a idealized one is written as you begin to evidence something, i.e. by asking service users and the like, what is your experience of this? What does make us effective? I promise you'll start hearing answers you didn't expect to hear, and then it's simply up to yourselves or your colleagues to say, okay, we didn't realize our work was being effective in the way we didn't think it was going to be. What are we going to do about that? There's a lot that was the biggest block. So 2 other quick things. I'll make sure I finish so there's time for questions. Just a couple of quick things on this question of spiritual impact. So it really builds on some of what I mentioned before about that framework of specificity. And there's at least, I think I've got 3 on my slides here that I'm going to show you of particular ways of thinking about, if you're trying to describe for someone spiritual change that you're aiming to have or going to have or hope you have had, 3 ways of doing it. The first one we often do is you think about relationships. So how is someone changing their relationship with God? How is it changing relationship with self? How are they changing potentially in their relationship with others or community? And the 4th one, which is increasingly important, how are they maybe changing a relationship with creation or the environment? And again, it's that level of human level, day-to-day level change. Like, I feel connected to God, I feel a sense of purpose, I'm taking more action to care for creation, whatever it might be, using that as a way of thinking through the change you're hoping to articulate. The second option we sometimes do is thinking about time periods. So if you're thinking about, actually, we're not sure, what we do is we create the conditions for spiritual growth. Then you can again think, what are those conditions that your organization or ministry is trying to create? And then we talk about characteristics of spiritual maturity. So these are what, from your perspective, are the marks or signifiers of a spiritual maturity if it was observed. And then we talk about consequences of spiritual maturity, which are, and what would you hope to be expected as a result of someone having a spiritual maturity as you've defined it. So again, it's not a straitjacket, but a way of really thinking, like when we think about spiritual change or spiritual outcomes, what do we mean by that? And that's again another helpful one of breaking it down to say, oh, what we mean is this, and this is what we're hoping to see or change. And then lastly, you can see that exactly the same framework, but maybe with some slightly different examples of thinking about if you're talking about spiritual growth or spiritual change, how are they believing differently? How are they behaving differently? How are you hoping they experience life, God, themselves, whatever it might be, differently? It was a really helpful way of pinning down what can feel very nebulous and hard to think about to something very grounded and very easy to understand. Then last but not least, is some steps. So this is the annual impact report. So this is something you're doing every year to talk about your organization, and you're calling it an impact report. Here's just 7 quick practical steps that I've learned in working on this process and in every job I had before this and doing it now as a consultant. So the very first thing and the biggest one is often missed out in my experience and cause a lot of grief is start by identifying what are the key messages you want this report to communicate. As I've said a few times, I think to this audience that makes perfect sense. To some audiences, that's a bit of a like, oh, I haven't thought about doing that. But whether that's the key, the key messages in the impact strategy model, those, questions really become key messages. Which one of these do we want to emphasize this year? Or whether it's I remember very distinctly an organization I worked particularly in full time, at the time, social mobility was like the big thing. So the CEO at the time said, right, our impact report this year has to be all about social mobility. So then we had to go through all of our, organization and try to work out which of these speak to social mobility. So the first thing, before you even start anything, right, what do you want this to communicate, and to which audiences? It's a bit of it'll save you a lot of time up front. And for a small organization, that's quite easy. For a large organization, that will be more of a process. Second, key advice is then create this skeleton structure of what you're going to go on each page and assign someone who's going to work on each of those pages. So let me just show you what I mean in the visual. Here is an example of just how we did this with the organization for Clean for Good in making an impact report for them. You can see on the left-hand side, it literally says step by step, page 1, and then it said what is the content. It's going to go on that page. In this case, we were doing it in partnership with Clean for Good. So it's like, who is going to write that material? Who is going to gather the evidence, whatever it might be? And then the right-hand side, a bit more detail. What is going to be in there? Is it going to be a graph? Is it going to be a story? Is it going to be a photo? Is it going to be a narrative? Is it going to be a text? It's an incredibly practical but helpful way of planning out, right, this is what's going to go in our impact report. And then step 4 just follows through very logically now, allowing those people to go and get that information and potentially realize we don't have any information on, the age of the people we support. Therefore, we should go and find some. We need another story that compellingly talks about how our training program, delivers on improved well-being for this type of person. How can we go and find that story? Bringing it all together, therefore, to see as a whole, is it starting to bring off those key messages you hoped? And then obviously, if relevant, visually designing it and publishing it. As I say, it seems very simple, but if you skip those early steps and just start kind of putting stuff in a document, they very quickly either become slightly unclear what they were trying to communicate, or as one I read the other day was like 70 pages of just lots and lots of activity, which, even as a reader, I was like, I wouldn't even read this. It's just way too much information. I don't know what you're trying to tell me about your organization. So 3 takeaways as I finish. Number 1, remember to think about your impact as your whole story, but just make it a very impact-centered story. And hopefully that framework I talk through is a very helpful, practical way of doing it. Secondly, the thing often comes to the more specific you can be, and particularly now we're talking about thinking about the changes, those outcomes you're trying to talk about, and the more specific you can be, the more compelling it can sound. And therefore, also when we talk about the spiritual space, the more grounded you can make that in what specific spiritual growth or change looks like, the helpful it is. And then lastly, in the same way that I'm sure many of you have a generic case for support, build that impact strategy as a generic version, a full version that you'll probably never show anyone in full, ideally with your evidence sources. And then you use that as your base to say, right, we're doing a fundraising campaign. We're putting some material out on socials. We're at an event. We're going to take that part and that part and that part. That's the way to go about doing it rather than trying to find one thing that fits everyone. But I will stop there.
Right. Well, just let me first of all say thank you, Philip. I thought that was really good, really interesting. If we were in the main room, we'd give you a clap. I don't know if people give it convert virtual claps or something equivalent, but I thought it was really helpful. Thank you. It's great to see how the different frameworks and how your own framework has evolved through your time working on these things. So thank you for that. If people have got any questions, can they type it in the chat? And there we are, got some virtual claps going on. Thank you very much. But while people are doing that, can I ask one question? Start with one question, and it's just about pictures and infographics. So we didn't talk about that. I mean, when I saw your page plan there was some mention of graphs and things like that. But they say a picture's worth 1,000 words or whatever the expression is. So and I suppose thinking out loud, you're quite right. Annual reports are becoming impact reports, and that's the sort of glossy version. The boring version on the Charity Commission, the trustees of account reports, very often doesn't have much in the way of pictures in there. So I think things can be explained in word. But just what are your thoughts on that? The importance of pictures, supplementing the report and bringing it to life, and to what extent should people be using that in their impact reports, and any advice you could give on that?
Yeah, I think as a overall rule of thumb, and this is why I said that bit at the beginning of the type of report we're talking about. If we're talking about a public facing impact report, then I think the more visual you can make it, the better. That would be my instinct, but I say that with a caveat of like, well, it sort of depends who it's going to, but I certainly the less text, the more graphics, the better. That would be my instinctive answer. But I would add, the more you can visualize all of those elements of your impact story, the better, rather than simply have lots of text and then some graphs for the outcome data. The more you can show profiles of the type of people, or like the real people, or the types of people that you support, I think that the more powerful it is. That would be my quick answer.
Yeah, thanks. And do you think charities should be using more pictures in the trustees' annual report and count on the charity?
um I've never quite thought about that. My instinct is, I would presume, yeah, if it's going on the charity commission, then I that audience is sort of an unknown audience of who's going to access it, legally speaking. So probably not. I think, as I said, in my experience, there's two approaches. One, some people write that one and then make a second simplified glossier one. Some people try and merge the two together, of which, when I've read those ones, I'm like, there's just lots of random information here. And one thing I didn't mention, I was like, I spent a bit of time working for Media Trust, so I have a very kind of communications hat on, and I read those reports being like, I don't know what you're trying to communicate to whom from this document. Therefore, it's just a bit of a mishmash, and I don't know how helpful that is.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I suppose it's less clear who the audience is on Charity Commission could be in, whereas with your supporters, you have a better sense of who's getting the glossy report. That's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Now let's see if we've got any questions. There's a comment from Vanessa. People remember how you made them feel. I've always felt people connect with stories and the emotion behind them. That's a good point, Vanessa. Thank you. Got any comments on that, Philip? Or
I mean, all I'd say is that's probably why I told the history, is that when I've worked within organizations, we've looked for those emotive case studies. I still use that framework to make sure that story is as emotive as possible. So what was the situation they were in? What was the challenge they were facing? How did going through the support or the resource make them feel, and how did they feel at the end? So even though it feels structured, it's structured in a way to try and get that emotion across, rather than simply the emotion of the beginning or simply the emotion of the end.
yeah,